Hello, everyone, and welcome to Whiskey Uncorked. My name is Brian, and we are back today with another Scotch whiskey review. This time, we're going to be talking about an interesting bottle of whiskey, both in smell, flavor, and maybe general online opinion. It has been picking up steam in terms of some chatter and recognition in the online Scotch whiskey community, to the point where it has been nominated for Best Value Whiskey in the online Scotch Whiskey Awards. Today, we're going to be reviewing the Glen Garioch 12-year-old. Before we get into the review, I really did just want to take a quick second and thank you all for reaching that 500 subscriber mark. It's flattering. In the grand scheme of YouTube, it's not a ton, but I think in the Scotch whiskey world and trying to build up a little bit of an audience, hey, I'm not complaining, considering we've really been doing consistent reviews and a little bit more organized videos since really February of 2024, even though we are coming up on the official 1-year anniversary at the end of November. So thank you again. I really do appreciate it. Thanks for all your positive feedback, not just with your likes and comments, but ultimately hitting that sub button. But enough of that. Let's talk about Glen Garioch 12-year-old. This has been a whiskey that I've heard murmurings of for a while now. Every once in a while, you'll get someone kind of popping up and saying Glen Garioch 12 is one of my favorite 12-year-old Scotch whiskeys in that kind of more affordable range. Although in the U.S., once again, that's not entirely true. But this has been one that I think people have just been liking for a really long time. And it's just now starting to gain some momentum. Now, that is not to say that it is universally loved. If you take a look around, you check Whiskey Base, there's people that frankly just don't like this whiskey at all. There's people that find certain things wrong with it. And then, like I said, you have people who are all the way on the other end of that spectrum where this is one of their go-to shelf staples. I've had this bottle now for a little while. I've been sipping on it. I opened it pretty much right away once I got it. And as you can see, I'm now with this dram, probably clearly under halfway through this bottle. And it's been a bit of a chameleon malt. I haven't fully wrapped my mind around it. I feel like I have a little bit better of a grip now than maybe I did, several months back. But it is still something where I haven't completely made up my mind, but I feel fairly confident in where it's going to land overall. So just generally speaking, Glen Garioch is owned by Beam Suntory. They are in the Eastern Highlands, and they are a very old distillery. I believe their founding date is listed as 1797, so they have literally been around forever. And they are a fairly decent-sized distillery, 1.5 million liters. They're not tiny, they're not big, they're kind of just in this kind of middle ground, probably on the smaller side overall. And most of their whiskey does go into blends. Now, the 12-year-old is a blend of bourbon casks and sherry casks. Don't know the proportion. I'm sure it changes from batch to batch just to maintain that consistent profile. But it is bottled at a healthy 48% ABV. It's non-chill filtered, but unfortunately, it does contain caramel coloring. So it is not a particularly dark whiskey with that coloring added. So I imagine this would be a fairly lightly colored Scotch whiskey. It's also possible that they use a very minimal amount of coloring. Either way, it's kind of strange, right? You're given that extra 48% ABV. You're not filtering it, but you just don't have the confidence to not put it out there with no caramel coloring. It's tough and it's strange, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. As I mentioned earlier, this has been nominated for the Best Value Whiskey category in the Online Scotch Whiskey Awards, the OSWAs. My brother and I got together. We did a chat. We just released like a 2-hour-long podcast series. Obviously, it's not a serious podcast. It's just two guys getting together talking about whiskey, and we just look for things to talk about. And the OSWAs are something we've been following since its inception back in 2021. And it's been fun just kind of going through that, seeing the evolution, seeing what other people are liking. And this year there were a number of changes that really kind of shook things up. And the Glen Garioch 12 beat out a lot of bottles that, frankly, I was surprised it was able to beat out. And I don't necessarily mean that purely from an enjoyment aspect or just overall quality, but Bunnahabhain 12 isn't there. Deanston 12 wasn't there. There's a whole list of whiskeys. Port Charlotte 10 was one that I was surprised got left out of that category this year. But again, not every whiskey can make that list. So it was just really interesting to see whiskeys like this and the Benromic 10 kind of beat out some bottles that were pretty staunchly ingrained in that particular category of whiskey. Check out that podcast. Go check out the OSWAs. OSWA.co.uk is the website that you can check that out, or just Google Online Scotch Whisky Awards. It's ran by Roy over at Aquavitae and Ralphie from Ralphie.com, or the Whiskey Bothy now. So check that out. It's fun. If you're a Scotch whiskey lover, vote, write in your people's choice if your bottle isn't there. It's a fun exercise to go through every year, and it does end up creating a pretty interesting list of whiskeys that you can pretty much rely on to be a pretty good starting point for beginners, or if you're looking for something new, even as an experienced whiskey drinker, there's usually something on there. Anyways, why don't we get to the nosing and tasting notes of this whiskey? As I mentioned, it's been a little bit of it's kind of been chasing a chicken around the farmyard. It's kind of morphed and changed, although I think I've got a pretty good bead on its core qualities. And the more I've drank it, the more it's started to make sense to me. But let's get into some nosing and tasting notes, give it a score, and we'll talk about value after that. All right, on the nose. Probably the first thing that jumps out of the glass is a bit of this kind of malty fermentation note. It's kind of got a little bit of a sour quality to it. Very kind of brewery-like. Maybe even going so far as to having like some hops and some fruitiness, maybe just slightly bitter. But yeah, let's see if there's anything else here. Fruit is citrus, lemon and orange. Yeah, it almost has kind of like a West Coast IPA vibe to it. There is some toffee and, like, again, maltiness kind of presenting itself as like a nougat, malted milk ball, that sort of thing. That kind of breaks that up, gives it some roasted qualities. But overall, I like the nose. It's interesting. It's not, I don't find it to be like intoxicating or just, man, something I really just want to sit there and nose for an hour before I ever take a sip or anything like that. It's interesting. There's some complexity. It's not so far one way is to be weird or anything like that, which I kind of felt like when I first got it. It just felt a little weird to me. But the more I've nosed it, the more it's kind of started to make sense and has fit into something that is recognizably Scotch. So, solid nose. Don't love it, but it's interesting enough to keep me engaged. But let's see how it's tasting today. Cheers. So it starts out really creamy. Actually, the entire experience really is pleasant to drink overall. There's some nice textures going on here, thanks to that non-chill filtration. The front, right, is kind of chewy and creamy, and then as you swallow it, it turns into kind of a salty or effervescent sort of kind of bite to it. Not hot by any stretch of the imagination, even at 48%. In fact, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second if I remember. But it's got a really nice kind of front middle palate. The finish lingers. It lingers more on kind of the middle of my tongue. There's like a real honey forward sweetness that kind of sits there for quite a while. Malty as well. The finish is a little bit drier, kind of on the back palate. It's drier. Some of the oaky qualities come through. The bottle has very little in terms of tasting notes. Oh, there is more down here, but it says fresh heather, rich poached pears, and the sweetest of malted barley, creme brulee, sweet ripe fruits, and just a hint of oak give this Glen Garioch a long and memorable finish. The finish is okay, long and memorable. I haven't had that experience really. There's a nice spiciness. This is one of the things that I think changes for me. Today, it's a little bit more kind of baking spice, cinnamon, ginger, that kind of spiciness. I have had days where it's a little bit more herbal. Some of that the sherry casks must be coming through, or I'm a little more sensitive to that. But usually it's a little bit more in this kind of ginger and cinnamon spice. But it's fairly light alongside that kind of effervescent saltiness. All right, let's do sip number 2, see if we can pull out anything else. Here we go. At times the sweetness is a little bit more toffee, but I think honey overall is probably the note I would go with. Citrus is there kind of alongside that salty bite. There's a touch of tartness. Again, I mentioned ginger. So like pickled ginger, you kind of get a little bit of that, just almost a refreshing tartness, which is kind of the strange thing about this, because you have something that I think you could describe as being refreshing, but there's a darkness to it. There's almost a bit of an earthiness. I won't go so far as to say like dirty, but there's a foresty elemental thing to it, kind of overall. So you have like these two competing things of something that could be kind of refreshing, tart, effervescent, fruity, but there's a earthy, almost smoky. This is completely unpeated. I don't think I mentioned that earlier. I think I saw other people mention that they get hints of peat smoke and stuff like that. I can see where that's coming from, and I think we're talking about the same thing, and that kind of earthy, almost gritty texture that kind of comes in on the finish, where the bottle says, you know, a hint of oak. Yes, there's some oak there, but there's also something that's almost kind of earthen to it. So great mouthfeel, interesting flavors. You've got some things that maybe don't always go together, but I think this whiskey does it relatively well. There's kind of some interesting juxtapositions there. The finish is okay. It's solid. It lingers for a while, but it's more so kind of what sticks to your tongue, and you're not getting a whole ton of evolution kind of on the back end, the traditional finish. Although there is stuff going on, and you can taste this whiskey on your palate for quite a while. Now, I mentioned that 48% ABV, and I think, again, I don't want to guess. It's one of those things where maybe this is why they did it. Sometimes when I see these kind of core range bottles, like at 48%, the Glen Murray 18-year-old, I think, was another one, where I think they almost bottled it at that ABV. They're not doing that to be generous or anything. Like, the whiskey actually needs to be bottled at that ABV. Otherwise, it might come through a little weak. Even though it's just a couple of percentage points, I really start to feel like some of these higher ABV bottles, not like Bruichladdich or anything like that, which goes all the way to 50%, but sometimes I wonder if they're bumping it up because the whiskey would be somewhat anemic even at 46%. But that's just conjecture on my part. It's just one of those things that I've noticed with a few of these bottles, that even from these major producers, these big massive producers who own a number of distilleries, kind of coming out of nowhere and releasing something at a ABV multiple percentage points higher than 46, where those whiskeys tend to have a little bit of like a weaker finish. And then obviously there are some people out there that would say that's because they're using cheap casks and you're not getting the full experience. But hey, I'm just reporting what I taste and trying to connect some dots there. Let me know if you have an opinion on that. I find that sort of stuff interesting, because from an enthusiast standpoint, you see 48% and you're like, oh yeah, man, this is going to be a big, bold whiskey. And this is certainly a flavorful whiskey. Don't get me wrong there, but it does feel like maybe there's a back half of this that is slightly lacking. Anyways, I actually really enjoy this whiskey. This has been a fun whiskey to figure out, but there's something that just hasn't lit me on fire with it yet. At the end of the day, this is a really solid whiskey. This is better than your average whiskey by far. I'm going to go with a 6 out of 10 above average. Thought about a 7, but this is one of those situations where, I found some things about this that were either A, maybe not traditionally in line with, I don't want to say quality. That doesn't really sound right, because you do have these kind of two different experiences happening at once, and it's not fully melded together. I enjoy it enough. I think that's been fun enough to kind of figure out, and the more I've gotten to know it, as I've said a couple times now, I've started to appreciate that. But I think for some people, if this is your, going out and buying your first bottle, you might have to spend some time with this for it to really start to click. And I definitely understand when reading some of those reviews where the people didn't necessarily really love this. But 6 out of 10 for me, could be a 7, but I'm gonna hold back a little bit just because I did find a couple things that weren't great about it. But it's still a good score, very good. Definitely better than your average one. And let's talk about value, because I think that might really come into play with a lot of people's enjoyment here. So I realized my brain's completely skipped over like the price of the bottle, although it would have been in the graphic that you saw when I was talking about the specs on this thing. But in the UK, it looks like this is about a 45-pound bottle, which would put it here 1-to-1 translation. We're getting really bad exchange rates right now here in the States. It's like a 15% difference from like springtime. So not great for us, but that would still put it at about a $60 bottle after tax. Unfortunately, this appears to be about a $70 to $80 plus tax here, obviously varying depending on where you live. So Bevmo here has this at $77 plus tax. This is an $80 bottle of whiskey. It's probably about $20 overpriced if you're comparing it 1-to-1 to the Great British Pound. And that really screws up that whole best value whiskey proposition if you're in the States. Hopefully, maybe where you were at, you can get it cheaper. Although this isn't a super common bottle here. It's something where you probably have to find either a real big box store or something that specializes in whiskey to find this. Even though it's owned by Beam Suntory, so you would think that maybe there would be some push for it here, being Jim Beam is involved in that, but whiskey's weird. Scotch whiskey is weird here. So $80 really kind of puts this at a different level. $80, I would say this is a relatively poor value. If you can get this under 70, I think you're probably getting something that's fairly solid in value. And if you're in the UK, I can definitely see why people are loving this. If you can pick this up for 45 pounds, $60, this would probably be more of a shelf staple for me at $60, although I don't have a whole lot of shelf staples since I rotate through things more often than I just always have a particular bottle on the shelf. So it ranges in the UK. If you're paying the 45 pounds or 60, if you can find this for $60, buy it, try it. Expect maybe a little weirdness if you're not a super experienced whiskey drinker. But if you are an experienced one who's been around the block a few times, this is probably something that you can at least learn to appreciate. But yeah, keep an eye on that price, particularly if you're in the US. All right, so this has been a fun bottle for me to review. It's been a fun bottle for me just to try to figure out. And this definitely wasn't 3-4 drams in. I think I got a good handle on it. It took me a little while, but I've enjoyed it and I appreciate the work that Glen Garioch is doing, minus the whole caramel colorant thing for whatever reason, especially since they sell it in a box. Again, it's the big producers. We are seeing a little bit of a move from some of them to at least try to give us some stuff that is more enthusiast focused. And Glen Garioch and Jim Beam in general Beam Suntory, has done a good job kind of retrofitting some of their distilleries, and Glen Garioch has been one of those. Right, they reinstituted the use of their malting floors, so they're at least going to be able to produce some of their own barley. I think they've started peating barley again, according to the Malt Whiskey Yearbook. This is where I'm getting most of this information from. The new one is on pre-order right now, so you can order it as shipping, I think, on October 5th. So yeah, if you're a Malt Whiskey Yearbook fan, go check that out. Ingvar Ron does a good job with that invaluable resource, especially if you are going to jump on in front of a camera and talk about some of these distilleries that you can't go visit, being over here across the pond. So, but yes, Glen Garioch reinstituting their own malting floors to at least get a proportion of their own malted barley. They've started peating barley again, so that would be fun, getting some actually peated Glen Garioch which I'm sure will not create any more confusion with whether the Glen Garioch 12 is actually peated. But, and they have, I believe, at least one of their wash stills, or their wash still is, I'm trying to remember how many stills they have there. I think they're a smaller distillery, so they don't have that many, but I think they've gone back to direct gas firing their wash still, which is good. That creates a little bit more flavor. It creates a little bit more complexity in the raw spirit. So hopefully we'll start seeing that soon. Well, in the next 6 to 8 years or something like that, hopefully. Probably closer to the 8-year mark, maybe. We'll start seeing some updated versions of the 12-year-old and some other expressions from them with these kind of retrofitted, going back to the old school style, a la, say, what Springbank has always been doing. But once again, thank you for subbing. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Let me know if you've got on with the Glen Garioch 12 yet. Are you one of the ones that absolutely adores this and thinks this is one of the best value whiskeys out there? Are you one of the ones where you just haven't connected with this one yet? Let me know in the comments. And please like, subscribe. Now we're on the track to 1,000. Looking forward to it. Excited for what the future will bring with this channel. But until next week with another whiskey review, cheers.